Okay, so welcome everybody for this first distinguished lecture. Professor Hurrell is currently Montague Burton Professor of International Relations at Oxford and a Fellow of Balliol College. He's been a member of the British Academy since 2011 and is a delegate of Oxford University Press. Professor Hurrell, for those of you who read in international relations, would know his work as a kind of inheritor of what used to be called the British School of IR. I don't know if the British School still exists, but I think one of its lineages was very much a historically and theoretically engaged approach to international relations. And that exemplifies, I think, Professor Hurrell's work. Some of you might have read, in fact, it's in front of me, I don't know whose copy that is, but his sort of, in a way, his magnum opus on global order, which is an incredibly dense but very rich and illuminating book, which reflects on the current state of the international and the global as both a political, economic, and a legal order. One of the things that I think distinguishes Professor Hurrell's work is his very close engagement with law, international law, the history of international law, and with a sort of sensitivity, a deep sensitivity to the politics of law and the legality of politics. So I think in another way that's somewhat characteristic of the British School of International Relations as opposed to the American school, he takes international law very seriously. And he's very interested in the normativity of legal orders in their political contexts. He is a very desired supervisor. Many people want to work with him, and indeed here, even at the Institute, one of our professors is one of his former supervisees, Professor Jennifer Welsh, who currently holds the chair of international relations in the Social Political Science Department. Andrew is somebody who takes the contemporary question of the multipolar world very seriously. He is a long-time scholar of Brazilian international relations and the wider context of Latin America, speaks Portuguese, and has spent some time in Brazil working with and on international relations. At the moment, he has a lot of collaborative projects on foot, something called the Post-Atlantic Age, the 21st Century Concert of Powers, a project on power and regions in the multipolar world, and another one on the global nuclear order. So I think his reflections today on human rights and global governance I expect to be very much politically and historically informed, but also I imagine a bit provocative and a bit different, because I think he's one of the most interesting and one of the deepest thinkers we have in international relations today. So please welcome Professor Hurrell.
Nehal said in the introduction, I'm neither a lawyer nor a human rights specialist, but I am very interested, and have been for a long time, in the relationship between international law and international relations. And I'm very interested in thinking or trying to think about shifting patterns of global order and where the different components of global order fit in some bigger picture. And obviously today, where human rights, where the place of human rights can be understood as fitting within the changing global order that we witness today. And I think what I would like to do is to raise some of the issues, some of the dilemmas, some of the problems that come from thinking about the relationship between human rights and the changing global order. It's both changing and, of course, from many perspectives, pretty worrying, pretty disturbing, pretty challenging in general terms, but also particularly in terms of what these changes mean for the international protection, promotion, of human rights. I think we can see, if we think and look around, we can see a global order that is moving towards greater instability, possibly towards greater conflict. We see, and I'll unpack each of these further as I go through the lecture, we see a return of geopolitics, major power politics. Think of South China Sea, think of the Ukraine. Geopolitics, major powers, intervention, balance of power in terms of how we describe, say, the greater Middle East, all these quote-unquote very old-fashioned ideas which many people in the post-Cold War world thought were gradually fading away. We see the spillover of geopolitics into many other areas of international life. So increasingly, when you look around and look at international economic relations, you see people claiming, oh well, we mustn't just allow the free flow of foreign investment, we must protect national interests, national security. Think of the spillover of geopolitics into cyber, into whole new areas of international life. So we have the return of geopolitics, we have structural inequalities and dislocations of global capitalism. And again, as I will talk about in more detail in a moment, that idea that the dislocations caused by rapid globalization, economic globalization, have helped to fuel new political forces in many countries which are anxious to protect national sovereignty, to take back control, to resist international norms and institutions having influence over what happens domestically, and that understanding those trends is closely connected with who's been winning and who's been losing through global economic globalization. So the return of geopolitics, the consequences of structural inequalities and dislocations in global capitalism, and new modes of political and social mobilization. Obviously, very often connected with new technologies, but not necessarily solely the product of those technologies, which are doing immensely important things to established political systems, political parties, political institutions. So changes in the global order in those directions, changes which are having very serious implications for what we've come just to easily talk about in terms of global governance. In the world and the literatures of global governance, the words that increasingly dominate the discussion are gridlock, stagnation, fragmentation. It is not a good time for global governance. We're working, maybe returning to a security environment where the United Nations will once more be fighting for its capacity to secure any influence in some of the major conflicts in the system, just as was the case during the Cold War. Even elaborate institutions, even some of the most successful institutions, have been meeting major challenges. The case of Europe and the EU is the most obvious example. There are major challenges in terms of some of the foundational norms of the international political and legal order. Think of the laws of war and humanitarian law, something I'll come to in a moment. And even in those cases where the practical imperatives seem so obvious for global governance and global cooperation, climate change most obviously, it is very clear that for large numbers of people, those practical implications, those quote-unquote obvious practical implications, don't seem so obvious. So those cases where practical implications seem so obvious, this isn't necessarily the case. And those cases where the imperatives for moral action in the face of widespread barbarism and atrocity are simply being met by radical inaction. Syria stands as a dreadful example. Now, all of these changes have real implications for the place of human rights. For many people, first point, many people in the West, they look at the place of human rights and they look at some of these changes going on in the global order, and they frame it in terms of a challenge to our Western liberal global order. We in the West are the upholders of a rules-based international order in which human rights occupy or should occupy a particularly important role. And what we see from this perspective, is a series of challenges. The balance of power in the world is shifting away from the West towards governments that are either authoritarian or at least very, very keen on protecting their sovereignty, very skeptical about international institutions, very skeptical about particularly cosmopolitan or expansive notions of international law and human rights. So one way of thinking about the challenge, which comes to many people, maybe particularly many people in Europe, is to see human rights as under threat from outside. In the world, those countries that in the post-Cold War world we'd assumed would dominate the global order and would have human rights as a central part of their purposes are threatened and challenged. The difficulty, this is the second way of thinking about the challenge to human rights of these changes in the global order. The difficulty of that is, of course, that many of the challenges to human rights don't just come from outside. They come from within, quote unquote, the Western liberal order, in at least two ways. The first is that those Western countries that saw themselves in the post-Cold War world as the promoters and upholders of human rights on a global scale have done a great deal through their own actions to discredit and delegitimize their position in the world. Think most obviously of the failed wars and interventions, the 4 or 5, depending how you count, failed wars and interventions that the United States has undertaken in the post-Cold War world. Think most obviously of the abuses, the systematic, shared, politically embedded abuses of human rights within Western countries as part of the so-called War of Terror. So one set of challenges within have to do with the post-Cold War experience, action of Western countries. But the second one, picking up the theme I just mentioned, has to do with the strengthening of those political forces within many Western democratic countries that are deeply skeptical of both international law and institutions and of human rights. This idea, which is obviously there in the forces that supported President Trump in America, but in many other countries, that national communities need to take back control of their fate, of their sovereignty, from bodies beyond the state. And that taking back control means, or is held to mean, the protection of nations or notions of the nation of the people. And of course, when you start to go down that road, America first, country X first, it doesn't really matter what name you put in front, when you start to go down that road, the dangers to human rights become obvious. Because anybody who is deemed not to belong to the people, to the nation, are automatically in a problematic position in terms of human rights. And the return of xenophobia, the return of exclusivist notions of political belonging, the return of overt racism in and across many Western countries represents or carries with it the darkest of echoes in terms of the fate of human rights in the modern world. So we have challenges. We have one way of seeing the challenges in terms of these countries, groups outside of the West that are challenging, but we have a very second series of challenges that come from within the West. And then thirdly, we have challenges which come from the nature of this more competitive, conflictual international system. If geopolitics, if big power politics, US, China, Saudi, Iran, if this sort of political action is once more coming to dominate international relations, then of course this has all sorts of indirect implications for how we think about the place of human rights. If countries are driven by security, by power politics, by geopolitics, that in turn is likely to fuel intervention, to fuel violations of human rights. It's certainly likely to make it harder to think about a productive role for existing international institutions. And it's certainly maybe even harder still to think about those areas where there is an obvious need for institutional renovation and reform. There can't be a clearer example of that than in the area of refugees and the need to refashion, to reconceive a international refugee order. So we have these many challenges. In terms of the way that the writing has been going, I noticed on the reading for the first week of the general course, you've already been, in a sense, reflecting on the way in which academic writing, both within international law and international relations, has come to focus on, as the titles of some of the books say, the darker side of virtue, to take David Kennedy's book, the way in which some of the post-Cold War ambitions, expectations about what the move to promote international human rights might actually mean in practice, why, in a sense, good motives won't necessarily lead to good results. I think I saw on the reading list for that course another of my former students, Steve Hopgood, who has recently wrote The End Time for Human Rights. And this idea that the human rights industry, with capital letters, has entered a period of, as he would see it, moral corruption and maybe moral bankruptcy. There's another book which I don't know if you have seen, but I think carries this maybe still further and is, I think, definitely worth thinking about. Nicola Perugini and Neve Gordon, The Human Right to Dominate. And it's quite interesting because they start the introduction with the campaign waged by Amnesty in the United States against NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. And they counterpose that with the earlier Amnesty campaigns in which, for example, Amnesty was reluctant, refused to embrace and support Nelson Mandela because of his association with the armed struggle. So they say, look, think back to the 1970s and 80s, this idea that human rights must be kept free from, quote unquote, contamination with force and coercion. And now here we have the leader of Amnesty US arguing in favor of continued NATO occupation and military engagement in Afghanistan and using human rights language as part of the justification. This will be a betrayal of Afghan women if NATO as a military alliance withdraws. So what do they draw from this? They draw the conclusion that the relationship between human rights, force, and coercion is much closer than many people would like to think. And they also draw from this the conclusion that one of the things we're seeing is a broader politicization of human rights, where many different groups, right across the political spectrum, and from many different cultures and countries, are using human rights for their own purposes. So we find, as is very common, I think, in many parts of Europe, the use of human rights language against Islam, on behalf of women, on behalf of gay rights, for example. We find the World Congress of Families supporting Putin on human rights grounds. And Perugini and Gordon quote from that, and they say, these inversions help expose that human rights, which most people assume to be progressive and liberating, can just as easily be connected with domination. So you can sort of see, David Kennedy, maybe Steve Hopgood talking about, the bad things that can come out of good attempts to promote human rights in the post-Cold War period. This is a stronger critique. This is arguing that there is something, in a sense, more deeply connected with the way in which people have come to think about promoting human rights, connected to patterns of force and domination. And I think it's a challenge to us to sort of take that kind of critique and to think what it might mean. So that's kind of my introduction. What I want to do now is I've got sort of four things to say. I want to say a little bit more, first of all, about the historical and theoretical context to the way in which the human rights debate has moved. I want to look a little bit more at some of the drivers of this maybe rather gloomy situation I just painted. I thought then I might just focus in on a couple of areas to sort of illustrate some of these themes, and I thought I might just look briefly at intervention and R2P on the one hand, and at the laws of war and humanitarian law on the other. And then I was going to come back at the end and sort of offer a few thoughts or throw out a few questions as to how we might respond. Do we, for example, in the kind of classic, actually the title of Steve Hopgood's first book on amnesty, do we just see human rights activism, human rights legal practice, human rights political promotion as keepers of the flame, as something that, however difficult the circumstances, the normative goal is to keep this going? Or do we think that the human rights culture, institutions, network of political and legal organizations needs to be recast, maybe reduced in ambition to fit these more troubling times? So that's where I'll get to at the end. Let me just get a glass of water. So let me say something about the historical context. It's been so easy to assume, in a sense, that the world started in 1989 or 1990, and that to contrast everything about where we are now with the post-Cold War world. So that so much of the discussion, as I've already indicated, about, say, human rights is, here was the 1990s, here was this enormous increase in the normative ambition of international law and society. Here were the great moves to expand the range of human rights, to expand the ways in which we thought about implementation, compliance, even enforcement, and then to, in a sense, mark off where we are against that. And of course, there is something worth doing in terms of that. But what it gets wrong is that it neglects, in a sense, where 1990 was, or it neglects the broader picture and scope of where the place of human rights has been. And indeed, actually, it almost encourages to get some of the history of human rights wrong. So a few things which I think might stand in need of correction. One is the fragility of liberalism. You know, you read Fukuyama, you think of the end of the Cold War, and you think it was just obvious and preordained that some version of liberalism, liberal democracy, liberal notions of rights was bound to win. Yet, you know, we know from the 20th century that for most of the 20th century, liberalism was on the defensive. Liberalism's gains were gained in the face of radical illiberal challenge. Human rights was born out of a sense of the fragility of the liberal order, not of the triumph of the liberal order. It was born out of what was wrong with Western societies, why Western societies were not, in their modernist, industrializing form, destined to produce good liberal things. Quite the reverse. For the first half of the 20th century was the century of the crisis of Western liberal modernity. Western liberal modernity had produced the most catastrophic wars, conflicts, and sufferings that humanity had ever seen. Notions of human rights and the possibility of human rights were born in response to that fragility, and were born in response to the awareness that irrationalism, that exclusivism, that racism were central to the Western liberal tradition, just as central to the Western liberal tradition as the road from the 18th century liberal enlightenment. And I think it's very easy just to forget the fragility, to take for granted the kind of obviousness of liberalism. And when we look around today and we see liberalism's many challenges, it's important to recognize that those challenges have very deep roots within Western society. Secondly, and moving on from there, the way in which we've told histories and stories of human rights has often assumed a kind of natural teleology, kind of natural sense of progress. Think of the language of generations of rights. You know, very, very common in the 1980s and 1990s. We moved through the generations, political and civil rights, economic and social rights, different forms of group rights. And the language of generations carries with it that notion of a kind of natural teleology. But even as a history of the 20th century, this is wrong, this is misleading. Think of the end of the First World War. Because of what the world looked like at the end of the First World War, including to many liberals and progressives. We had the First World War, but we also had the Russian Revolution. Capitalism was in trouble. It was axiomatic to many people that workers' rights, the ILO, the labor organization, managing, taming capitalism, was a central part of progress. This was obvious. Workers' rights had to be there. They were fundamental. Economic instability, inequality was a central part of the liberal package. But march on 20, 30 years, that just disappears. It's not teleology, it's almost the opposite. A really important part of the rights agenda just drops out of, effectively, the picture in the 1940s. The great moves from the Declaration through to the governance, the 40s to the 60s. So the sort of teleology can easily lead us to miss out very important things. Think about migration. Think about the role and the place of peoples. Now, obviously, people make much of the idea that 51, the convention, the way in which refugees are understood, is a product of a very particular time, Cold War situation in Europe and so on. There was never really, in a sense, a demand or a desire to think of a global refugee regime. And we've all, in a sense, been living with the problematic consequences of that. But more broadly, the position of migration in international politics has often depended on these bigger patterns of big power politics. When non-Western countries started to accumulate more power, Japan most obviously in this case, it started to demand that the conditions of its citizens, of people who shared its ethnic attributes, should be treated as matters of international concern. Japan pushed on questions of migration. This is Imperial Japan during and after the First World War. It very famously pushed on questions of racial equality, pushing the racial equality clause during the Paris negotiations at Versailles, and it lost. The Western countries, Western empires at that time were able to push this aside. Migration assumed a particular form. But the shifting patterns of power are changing that again. Very interestingly, when in the great post-Brexit Britain, British prime ministers march off to India and want to talk about trade agreements and new ways of engaging the world, one of the things that they're told is that, yes, maybe we will talk about the trade agreements, but we want to talk too about the rights of our citizens in your country. Ditto in the case of what Trump's America is finding as it seeks to engage both with, say, India and China on trade. So, again, we can take an issue like migration, it can assume a very natural form, but that form is subject to particular historical circumstances. A third example of the history, which I think we need to remember, is the role of democracy. Again, in the post-Cold War world, we kind of assumed, it came very easy to assume, that democracy and human rights went together. International law should make a much greater attempt to bring democracy into the fold, the international legal fold. Think of Tom Frank's famous article. Many, many theorists sort of talked about the indivisibility of democracy, democratic rights, and human rights. They became much more closely connected together. Those concerned with practice said, well, if we want to promote human rights, then surely the obvious thing to do is to promote those forms of government that are most likely to secure the protection of human rights. Well, yes, except that again, if we think historically, we'll see that that linkage is much less obvious. There were many people, and the dominant view in Western countries through certainly most of the post-Second World War period was that democracy and human rights don't naturally go together. Theorists Isaiah Berlin, John Elster pointed out, of course, that there's a deep tension between democracy and human rights. The point of human rights is to ring-fence certain parts of politics away from direct democratic action. That's what human rights are all about. Human rights as trumps. There are certain sorts of things which are not like other parts of the political system. And of course, murderous, tyrannical majorities have historically been able to do terrible things to the rights of minorities. Democracy, economic success, human rights as going together, the post-Cold War package. Therefore, in a sense, I think we must recover and remember that it looks much more obvious, much more unobvious when we look at it more closely. And in many of the areas, the backlash against international institutions is caught in this historic dilemma. Europe is a very clear example. When the founding fathers of Europe, around here, were thinking about how to construct a European project that would both be economically successful and protect peace and human rights and democracy, they looked back to the interwar period, and they saw a period in which populist democracy had been directly implicated in the rise of fascism. So they created a world, an institution, that was built around constitutionalism and rights. It was built about constraining democracy, limiting democracy. And so when people complain about the undemocratic nature of the European project, in a sense they're right, but they're complaining against something that was designed in this way. So the point I want to make is that when we think historically, the links, the tensions between these different components, I think, are much more complicated. So a little bit on history, to say that when we look back historically, we don't just see a sort of straightforward teleology. We see something more complicated, and out of those complications, we see things which I think matter for how we think about human rights today. Let me just say a little bit analytically, tiny bit theoretically, about how people have thought about human rights. Certainly within international relations, but I think implicitly in international law, the dominant mode of thinking about human rights has been sort of variations of the idea of expansion through diffusion. Human rights, the work of norm entrepreneurs, the work of human rights NGOs start in one place. They start in the West, and then they spread. The story of the 1990s was how the Western order could be expanded to other parts of the world. So think of, Catherine Sickink, think of Finnemore and Sickink, think of notions of life cycle of norms, cascading norms, metaphors of socialization and internalization. The whole focus is on how we can get they to be more supportive of human rights. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it has tended to dramatically underplay the agency of the non-Western world. As another of my former students, Hurrell, has written, it really treats the sufferers of human rights abuses as mere objects. It denies them voice. And again, much of the critical literature over the past decade or so on human rights has been about this notion that surely human rights should not just be about outsiders protecting other groups. It should be about finding ways to give political, to respect the political subjectivity and the political agency of different groups. Again, in reaction to this mode of thinking, we've seen much more attempt to talk about notions of translation, localization, what happens when human rights norms move from one place to another. And one of the really important things, I think, that's come out of those debates has been to maybe slightly take the edge off the idea of some of the debates about sort of cultural conflict and cultural diversity. The idea that, at a certain level, human rights norms may be shared, at a very general, abstract, programmatic level. But what becomes really important is what those human rights norms mean to real people in real situations on the ground. So one sort of analytic way of thinking has been this kind of diffusion idea, which has dominated so much of the academic literature and sort of clearly inspired, stood behind a great deal of Western practice. We won the Cold War, we're the center of this global liberal world, we need to take these values to other parts of the world, history is moving in our direction, we need to nudge it along. And if we can't nudge it gently, then at least in certain circumstances, more coercive intervention is clearly right and justified. The other sort of theoretical point, I think, is obvious, which is that, in a sense, the world of post-Cold War human rights has been focused very obviously around the autonomy, the value of individuals. You say, well, what's surprising about that? That's the whole point of human rights. Human rights are things that you enjoy by virtue of being human. True and obvious and important, but just maybe to remember that human rights are not the only way of thinking about greater global justice. For many people, after the end as empires ended, as the colonial world wound down, as new countries became important, what mattered was effective political agency, was that countries should acquire the power and capacity to change and challenge the rules of the global liberal order. Global justice meant more power for the states and societies of the non-European world. This was very much the way in which global justice was thought about, say, in the 1960s and 1970s. What happens as the West defeats that way of thinking, it comes to replace it with what we take to be a much more obvious, and in many ways much more obviously justified way of thinking about human rights. How can global justice be about giving more power to third world countries, which may be ruled by, corrupt dictators casting money off to their bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, or Switzerland torturing their own citizens? Surely it's obvious that global justice has to be about the protection, the cosmopolitan protection of individual human rights. Normatively, enormously powerful, enormously convincing critique. And yet, that move can also be disempowering rather than empowering, because effective agency, the effective capacity of those who've been marginalized, weakened groups, can be a very important, maybe a necessary part of any sort of fighting demand for justice. Okay, so a few things analytically and theoretically. Let me just sketch through some of the drivers for where I see the global order being and what they might mean for human rights. And I have sort of four drivers. We've seen in many countries, if you ask many people, well, what is the challenge to human rights? They will say, as I said a moment ago, well, if we look in country X, we'll see the rise of populist, nationalist, xenophobic political movements, denying that human rights should be protected domestically, certainly rejecting notions that bodies external to the state, to the nation, should be allowed any role in determining what happens in those countries. So nationalism, identity-based politics has been visible in many places, often almost always justified in particularist terms. Our nation is different to everyone else. Our national values must be respected. But the fact that these changes have been happening in so many countries, in so many different parts of the world, clearly indicates that something bigger is going on, that we can't explain it just in terms of what's happening in country X or country Y. So what might they be? Well, again, these four things. The first is the return of interstate power political competition and geopolitics. The liberal way of thinking about the post-Cold War world stressed interests above all. There's a common interest in global governance, there's a common interest in solving problems. Neglected the two other sides of the sort of the great political triangle. Neglected power. We do want to solve common interests, but we care hugely who gains how much from solving those common interests. Just think of Trump standing on the White House lawn talking about climate change. And the interest view neglects values. Whose values are going to be reflected in the way that we solve those common interests? So political competition and value competition is firmly back on the interstate agenda in big and, I think, very important ways. So interstate competition is one driver. Secondly, again, pick up and maybe just say a little bit more about the global capitalism thing. It's become very common talking about, say, Brexit, talking about Trump, talking about developed countries to talk about the winners and losers of globalization as being central drivers to understanding where we are. I think we have to see again the winners and losers in global terms. And it's not just a matter of the top and the bottom, you know, the fabulously wealthy and the hugely impoverished. Politically, it's the groups in the middle that in many ways are the most important. So in northern countries, again, the Trump phenomenon, those groups that had previously seen themselves as having a secure role, the future belongs to the blue-collar, lower middle class Americans, those groups have sunk down on almost all of the distribution side. That notion that our country is being taken away by other people has become a common theme. But across the emerging and developing world, we've seen a different phenomenon, a phenomenon born of success rather than failure. We've seen maybe 300 million people move up out of some of the lowest reaches of poverty, the so-called new middle class, misnamed new middle class across the emerging world, people who have moved out of radical poverty, but into a situation where they're still enormously vulnerable, but they're able to demand more things against governments that are often very unable to provide them. And it's that I think provides very fertile ground for the nationalism that we see in many parts of the developing and emerging world. And it's that explains why we see so many demands for states to do things that they're not able to do, which is why corruption and anti-corruption has become so powerful. So a second driver for this situation, this global order that we see, has to do with the different patterns, the dislocations of global capitalism, and the demands that they're fueling for a kind of more nationalist, more sovereigntist view of politics. A third driver, which we can sometimes forget, certainly here in Europe forget, because the debate becomes so kind of closed and parochial and introspective, is what I call the power of the new global. Again, if we look back and see how global order has moved, we can see that the position of the West has lost power not just since 1990, not just since 1945, but over a broader period of time. So this is the world of the BRICS, this is the world of emerging powers, but it's not just the world of emerging powers. It's the world of a set of changes where the position of the West, of Western values, of Western ideas about global order, has come to be challenged by a broader diffusion of power and agency across the international system. So there's far greater heterogeneity in the system, there's far greater diversity of values and preferences on the part of a much wider range of political agents that are able to push those values. So we sometimes think about them most obviously in terms of the rise of China, the demand for non-Western values, non-Western ideas of rights to be embedded legitimately in the institutions of international law and society. But it's not just a set of changes that is connected, I think, to the rise of emerging powers, nor is it necessarily just connected to demands that our values, these whatever they might be, different sets of values, should have equal say in the way that international law and international institutions function. A few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, I was in Tokyo for a symposium on a book on trans-civilizational international law by Yasuaki Onuma. And the point that Onuma makes about Asian values is this. He says, well, Asian values, we know that Asian values debate was a pretty kind of corrupt and not very nice debate. Asian values were being used by authoritarian governments across the region in order to protect themselves and their power against Western attempts to push human rights and democracy. True, but that doesn't legitimize or delegitimize the need to say that a recognition for difference is a central part of what a global normative and legal order needs to be. So for Onuma, the recognition of Western dominance, the recognition of diverse ways of ordering society needs to be there as part of the road to reaching something that he would like to see as a kind of trans-civilizational international law. Okay, let me then say something about these sort of two areas. I mean, we could talk about lots of different areas, but let me just pick up intervention and the laws of war as two that I think bring kind of politics and law and human rights together in sharp and quite difficult ways. Intervention first. Again, we need to slightly free ourselves from the post-Cold War world. The post-Cold War world has said, you say intervention, and everybody thinks of humanitarian intervention, R2P, protecting peoples against atrocity crimes. This is what intervention means. Well, yes, except if we go back in time, intervention was a category of international legal and political life that was much bigger and broader than that. Intervention, if we go back, say, to the theorists of the 18th century, to Vattel, to the legal writers of the 19th century, intervention was trying to claim a space, to understand a space between peace and war, to sort of describe what that space might look like, to give a definition of what some of the problematic areas in that space might be, and to, if not subject them to legal regulation, at least to sort of agree on certain sorts of principles that might be important in the law and politics of that area. What does that mean? Well, it means that in terms of the purposes of intervention, yes, obviously, solidarist intervention, intervening to protect people, to promote what we would now describe as human rights, was always there. It was there in Vattel in the 18th century. But it's never been the only purpose, or not necessarily the primary purpose, of what international law was doing when it talked about intervention. Arguably the primary purpose, particularly when international political times was hard, was problematic, was conflictual, the primary purpose of ideas of intervention was to try to find some way of managing the big power problematic political relations between major powers. It was a way of trying to reach certain sorts of agreements as to how particularly murky, messy conflicts might be stabilized in political terms. So a different set of purposes to those that we associate with the idea of humanitarian intervention, but, and this is the important point, purposes that might be connected. So if you think of the 19th century, we had a lot of humanitarian intervention, but that humanitarian intervention often depended on the capacity of big powers to agree where it could happen in ways that would not mess up big power relations. Now, that sort of way of thinking, we've kind of gone away from because for very good, normatively justified reasons, we've wanted to think about humanitarian intervention as the dominant frame. When we look and think about somewhere like Syria today, we maybe need to think again about these two sides, whether the United States and Russia might be able to agree on certain sorts of political, probably just political rather than legal norms, to manage their joint involvement and intervention in the conflict, and whether those might be the key to forms of humanitarian relief, including institutionalized humanitarian relief for those suffering so appallingly in the conflict in Syria. So intervention, my first point, is to again press you to think beyond the Cold War and to think about the role of humanitarian intervention within the broader debate on intervention. Let me now just say something on the other side of, following on from that under intervention, about humanitarian intervention and R2P. Now, R2P is an obvious case of pushback, backlash. You know, this was the great hope, 2001, 2005. This is where the international community is really moving, is generating a new consensus. Probably more of a political consensus than a strictly legal consensus. This is I'm really stepping here very much on the toes, on the work of Jennifer Welsh, my erstwhile student and friend here. Jennifer is one of the great authorities and writers on R2P. A political consensus that sought to build on, to strengthen existing legal obligations to protect populations, to protect or to implement existing humanitarian law. Big-ish hopes that this, all right, still difficult set of negotiations in the early 2000s, lots of developing emerging countries very sort of resistant to the idea of legitimizing Western intervention, the United States itself being very, very worried, as it always has been, about international law constraining its freedom of action. But despite of those, the optimists saying, look, no, we really got something. We really managed to secure something. And yet, again, for the pessimists looking around the world and seeing, well, just look at the number of places where we see war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity with very little international response. Just look at the emergence of violent extremist movements who celebrate violence in an appalling way. You know, surely it's obvious that R2P has, in a sense, just quote unquote failed. Before we reach that conclusion, we might just, ask this question: what does it mean to say that an international norm of this kind has died or been eroded? Because some might say the contestation of a norm is often a sign of its continued life. Is it obvious that kind of factual inactivity is the right way of thinking about when a norm, when we've seen sort of retrocession? After all, just a few points. Firstly, since 2016, or by the end of 2016, we've seen continued resolutions, 35 odd in the Security Council, invoking R2P and the importance of R2P, including in direct, actionable involvements. We've seen the General Assembly, a broader assembly, decide that they want to continue consideration of the principle. We've seen a lot of talk in a lot of those countries that were supposed to have rejected R2P, accepting the idea that somehow it is a part of the international kind of language of international politics, including China. China's described R2P as an important prudential norm. So non-Western acceptance. We can see the argument that says the whole point of R2P, the basket, the pillars, all of these things, was supposed to be that it isn't just about military intervention, so it's wrong to say that the absence of military intervention is a sign that R2P is failing. And again, the optimists say contestation, finally, proves that the norm has some life. When Russia says it's intervening in South Ossetia because of R2P, and everyone says, no, this is nonsense. This is a sign, if everyone is agreed that it's nonsense, that actually the norm is still alive. So you can make those sort of arguments, and I think it's a really important question, difficult question, conceptual question about what constitutes norm death, norm erosion. What's the role of different forms of contestation in those changes? My own view is that you can do all of those things, and yet it's still quite difficult not to reach reasonably pessimistic conclusions about the contestation over the military side of R2P, especially post-Libya. The reluctance to use the language of R2P, particularly on the part of the United States, even under Obama, is a reflection of that difficulty. And even looking at the R2P norm complex more generally, we still see a great deal of contestation about what the different parts and pillars of it are supposed to be about. A few minutes now on the laws of war, and then I will conclude. The laws of war, the coming together of human rights and international humanitarian law, really interesting, obviously from any practitioner's point of view, but really interesting theoretically, because they bring together these two sides of how we think about international law and society. On the one hand, obviously a very rights-based one, but on the other, a much more sort of prudential, interest-based one. Now, there's a view of what's gone wrong with the laws of war, which stresses the impact of the changing character of conflict and new forms of technology. So we see new forms of groups fighting, irregular forces, non-state armed groups. How can traditional international law do anything about them? We see obviously lots of new technologies, drone strikes most obviously, and what those things are doing, so the critics say, or so this line of analysis says, is it's undermining the old prudential, interest-based foundations of the laws of war. The laws of war were there not because people, or not just because people had humanitarian goals. They were there for very powerful prudential reasons. If you're fighting war, if war is a part of international life, you have a reciprocal interest in minimizing some of its effects. What on this view has happened is that that kind of basis has been eroded by the changing character of war, changing character of conflict, and by new technologies. Now, there's undoubtedly something very powerful in that argument. It's a very important argument. But it's not the only way of thinking about what's been happening in terms of the laws of war. And arguably, and I'm sorry I'm rather listing a lot of troubling and depressing changes, arguably, in a sense, perhaps just as important, I might even be inclined to say more important, is that restrictions on the laws of war, the protection of the rights of combatants and non-combatants in conflict, has depended not just on interests, not just on notions that people bear rights, but also on notions that there is some mutually accepted justification for using violence in the first place. That, of course, we don't like violence, and we certainly don't like you using violence, but we kind of understand what violence is somehow for. And one of the, I think, truly alarming developments in the character of conflict is that idea that people are using and justifying force in ways which really make any form of deliberation and discussion very difficult. So we have militant Jacksonian kind of Trumpism on the other hand, just going back to a kind of crude 19th century way of thinking. We're using force because we have every right, that's what we're going to do, and it's great. We have obviously all sorts of foundational arguments, both of a religious kind, but also of a secular kind, saying war is about absolute fundamentalist values, and that those values preempt any of the prudential thing. So we obviously think of religious justifications for violence on the one hand, but we should also, maybe problematically for many people, think about some of the arguments that liberals have advanced. Think of so-called neoclassical just war theory, for those of you in that world, who've said, the old-style laws of war, competent, non-competent, divisions, the idea that all civilians are naturally innocent, we should get rid of that. We should think about the individualization of conflict. We should think about being much more fine-grained in our judgments of what is good and bad, what is right and what is wrong. Well, if you start to have those sorts of very different languages crossing, it becomes very difficult to have a conversation, to have deliberation about what the purposes of international humanitarian law is all about. And this really matters, because if we go back to foundations, what is law doing in the world? Well, obviously law is doing some of the things we all want it to do. It's institutionalizing norms and values. It's coming up with institutional mechanisms for actually making those things have some bite in the world. But it's also very fundamentally about providing a normative language for thinking about order, a language in which very different people from very different perspectives, cultural, political, religious, can talk to each other. And it's the erosion of that which I think is often one of the most serious signs and challenges to international law. So let me conclude, and then you can tell me all the things that I've missed out and should have said. Hard times are, of course, exactly when human rights has to move forward in a normative sense, and also when human rights have moved forward. I mentioned the 1940s, we all think of the mid-20th century in Europe, but the 1970s are another period. The 1970s were a time when many of the same arguments were being made about just how difficult it was to push human rights forward. This is obviously the period of campaigns about authoritarianism in Latin America, about racism in Southern Africa. It's the period of renewed superpower, late 1970s, renewed superpower intervention in the third world. But it's also the period where the human rights historians like Sam Moyne have increasingly brought our attention to, where transnational human rights advocacy, many of the things we take for granted, really got going. So bad times are very important times for thinking about human rights. And yet we still need, even if that's true, to think about what do we do? What kind of human rights order do we want to aim at? Well, one is to say, in a sense, much of what I've just been talking about doesn't really matter. After all, the purpose of human rights is to maintain a normative agenda, to keep pushing the boat out despite the fact that it's often very difficult, and to work within, to work in the practical areas, the areas within institutions. What have been the great gains for the human rights culture, the human rights world of institutions? They haven't necessarily been, maybe not at all, the big summits, the big declarations. They've been the way in which human rights has become institutionalized in many of the mechanisms of national governments, of international bodies. I think the last time I was at EUI for a straight human rights conference was a conference on mainstreaming human rights in international organizations. So you could say, in one place, in one thing, we don't, in a sense, really need to maybe worry too much about much of what I've said, because the real work will always be work within and work on the ground. And I think there is clearly something in that, and yet I'm not sure how much it does to sort of counter some of the things, the challenges I've said. What about questioning expansion? The whole theme of the post-Cold War world was normative expansion, expansion in the agenda of human rights, in the institutions of human rights, in the density of the language of human rights, in the density of the system. Should we question that? Again, go back to the 1970s. Human rights was a very hard time, enormous ideological divide, north, south, east, west. What were some of the arguments that were pushed? Well, one very famous one, pushed by a friend and colleague, Henry Shue, was the idea of basic rights. We need to prioritize. We can't just multiply and divide human rights forever. We can't just have more and more and more of them. We can't just have more and more ambition. We actually need to decide what is the most important thing that international society has to do and promote in human rights. So one question is that idea, can we actually think again about some notion of basic rights, some notion of prioritization, or are the arguments about the indivisibility and the interlinkage of human rights simply too complex and too difficult to disentangle? So that's one question about expansion. Can we pull back? Another area where we might need to think of pulling back is in terms of the role of human rights within what one might grandiosely call the international rule of law. For those of you who've looked, in a sense, beyond human rights at some of the debates on the international legal order, the global legal order, there's been a move there to say, well, look, global governance is hugely complex. We've seen this massive spread of global governance institutions in all areas, functional areas, normative areas, across all sorts of different aspects of international life. It's created real problems of legitimacy, of accountability. How do we overcome those? Well, one way of overcoming them is to try, as that language has it, to kind of constitutionalize the global legal order, and to see as part of that process of constitutionalizing both certain procedural norms, but also some substantive norms, which, when you come down to it, are some of the core norms of the human rights system. So on this view, it's not just human rights qua human rights that matter. Human rights matter for how we think about the international legal order as a whole. And that, I think, mode of expansion has been very important, but I think, again, and this is where I will stop, needs to be questioned. Can we think about a way of understanding the global rule of law which is not just focused, or not primarily focused, on a list of substantive human rights norms? For me, my own alternative way of thinking about the rule of law is to pick up some of the arguments of Jeremy Waldron, and again to focus perhaps more on process, on agency and dignity, that what matter when we think about international law and the international legal order are those norms, processes, and institutions that help threatened individuals give accounts of themselves, help them to be heard, help them to find a basis for protecting, in the first instance, being able to protect their own interests, that all legal understandings of a rule of law have to be based in the first instance on the agency of those threatened. Where will this take us? Well, who knows? I can only, I think, take comfort from the point, I think, that hard times are precisely the times when human rights really do matter. That after all, we can debate for a year and a day the foundations, the political theory of human rights, the debates about cultural relativity and so on and so forth. And yet at the end of the day, at least for me, it is the shared and widespread apprehension in the face of cruelty, of barbarism and oppression. It is the shared awareness of human suffering itself, that brute fact of social life, which is the sort of irredeemable baseline of what human rights are about. And that way of thinking about human rights in terms of the brute fact of social life is perhaps the most resilient bridge we have between the objective positions of impartiality, institutionalization, which are central to moral judgment, to legal ordering on the one hand, and the subjective commitment to particular affection, to particular histories, to particular groups that are central to all moral purpose and passion on the other. And I'll stop there.